Great. Hi, Dylan. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, thank you. I'm excited to kick off this discussion with you because you're currently pursuing your undergrad, and as we were discussing briefly before this, I feel your insights would be very valuable for a lot of aspirants in high school right now, trying to make or forge a similar career path as you have for yourself. So before we dive in, why don't you just give us a little background about what program you're doing and where you're at?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so my name is Dylan. I'm a first year at Stanford University. I'm currently studying political science, American studies, and sociology. So all of those interdisciplinary fields and so forth. I think Stanford just offers you that interdisciplinary education where you can get the best of STEM while the best in humanities and social sciences. So I'm really excited to be part of this university, and I'm excited to share it with all of you.
That's amazing. So what inspired you to essentially choose this school particularly? I know Stanford's huge, it's kind of goes without saying, but I'm sure there was some logic or method to the madness essentially. So why don't you sort of walk us through what made you choose the school and the program itself?
Right. And so what I love about Stanford is that you get basically the best of everything at this school. So, as a person coming from California, Stanford, obviously being a school in California, you have the weather aspect, right? One of the biggest things right now when choosing a university is where do you want to be during the winter, right? One of the biggest things when I was deciding was that in the East Coast, it was snowing and so forth. And I really wanted that sunshine during the winter time to make sure I'm active and studying and so forth. But if I want to go into the concrete reasonings behind Stanford, in terms of the academics, when you come into campus, one of the biggest things is that we're top five in everything, except for maybe architecture or something like that. But when it comes to choosing a major here, they stress this interdisciplinary education where you come in, you have a major in mind. I talked to other people, they're like, public policy, economics, computer science and so forth, but then they go into different fields. They learn about sociology, they get a minor in human rights, they learn about the education program here. And one of the biggest things that I wanted out of my education was an interdisciplinary one. And so one of the biggest things coming to Stanford was that I knew that political science was huge at Stanford. One of the biggest things about our political science program is that, for example, the person that runs the Freeman Spokane Institute for International Studies is former US Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. Francis Fukuyama, one of the leading institutionalists within the political science realm, teaches here. But you also have people here that focus on different fields, just as race with Dr. Hakeem Jefferson or democracy reform or Dr. Adam Monica. And what I liked about this education was that you get the best in terms of political theory, you understand foreign policy, you understand political economy, but at the exact same time, data science is key. And so, in a world that's continuing to progress forward, being a part of a university in Silicon Valley and using those tools to help out with your social science research and humanities is really important. So I really enjoyed Stanford's interdisciplinary education and also the programs that are involved in it. I never knew that I would basically go into sociology or American studies beforehand along with political science, and now I am. So I think that's one of the biggest things when it comes to Stanford. And then also in terms of just the culture, I mean, we just won the national championship for men's gymnastics in the United States. And we strive towards excellence in both athletics. We have the most national championships out of any other university in the United States when it comes to sports. And so I think that culture of unrivaled excellence in all paths is why I chose Stanford. And I think that's why it's also a good university to apply to as well.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic reason. Is there a lot of flexibility with respect to the programs that you're doing and maybe the program that you choose to begin or apply with? But is there a lot of flexibility then going into the program and changing streams?
Right. So one of the big things about Stanford is that everybody that comes into Stanford is undeclared. So you might apply on the common application or another college application, stating your top three choices in a major and so forth. So for me, I chose, political science, I think economics and public policy. And so when I came into Stanford, though, nobody's major is decided. And one of the biggest things about Stanford is that you can choose any class to take. And so for me, I chose a class called Colonial Revolutionary America in like my first quarter. It was history class. But for me, that class really propelled what I loved about American Studies. American Studies is a program at Stanford, but basically takes the interdisciplinary approach to politics, history, but also comparative race studies, and other humanities subjects as well. And what I loved about it was, wow, I can take this class, and then next quarter, I this quarter I'm taking a class about economics, and then next year I'm going to be taking a CS class, right? What I like about that is that you're not stuck into a major
Right.
in terms of taking those classes, and you can take whatever classes you want. Now there are these requirements, we call them WAIS requirements. Basically, you have to take a class that's focused on, let's say, scientific methodology as like one of the classes. But you can, you'll as you go on with your major, Stanford basically forces you to be interdisciplinary, what I like to say. So basically, with my political science degree, I have to take a statistics class, a CS class, a data science class, and so forth. So I think I like that personally. And then other people, they don't know what their major is just yet, and they're juniors, right? But they'll figure out a way to major. But one of the biggest things that I would like to say about Stanford, I think sets it apart from any other school, is its co-terminal program. And so basically with its co-terminal program, basically you can get a master's in 4 years or 5 years. And so basically one of my friends, his name is Avi Gupta. He just got accepted to Harvard Law School. At Stanford, what he did was he majored in political science and got his master's in computer science in 4 years. And that's what I want to do with political science as a primary major, American studies as a secondary major, and then a master's in sociology. So a lot of possibilities at Stanford, and you should definitely apply.
Oh, wow, that's wonderful. I think that in itself is just going to excite a lot of people. I'd love to understand your thought process of also applying to other schools. I mean, were those in the picture? And then how do you streamline maybe, deciding when you're getting accepted into multiple schools and then choosing what's the thought process behind that?
Right. I think one of the biggest things was when I was applying to other schools, I always knew I wanted to do political science. So I tried to find schools that were really great at political science, but also the interdisciplinary effort. And so when it came down to it, I got accepted to other peer institutions, such as other schools in California, like UC Berkeley, UCLA. I got accepted to Cornell as I think it was called like a main egg family scholar and so forth. And then I got full scholarships to Notre Dame, USC, and other institutions as well. But one of the biggest things that I was considering when, choosing the school that, I wanted to go to comparatively was that which school is going to offer me the education that I want, and then the commute, and then the work opportunities afterwards. And so when you apply to a school, you have to be cognizant of that because, for example, let's say the Ivy League, right? The Ivy League is different. Like every single school, sure, they're all part of the East Coast, but each school is different in their own way, right? One of the things that people don't really usually know about is that when it comes to the Ivy League, Cornell is the biggest Ivy League. It has the most amount of students as compared to, let's say, Dartmouth, which is in the middle of New Hampshire, right? I mean, you're really secluded, right? Columbia, you're right in the city. So that culture is really going to be something that you have to take into account as well. Do you like that fast-paced culture as well? And then also when you're thinking about schools, let's say in California, right? You see Berkeley, right? I mean, they have great programs when it comes to physics, computer science, biology, and so forth, but you're really in that big atmosphere up by Oakland. And so when deciding to apply to a school, make sure where do you want to live in the future? Where do you want to make change? For me, I thought Stanford was great in that aspect because you have Silicon Valley, but you also have a major city of San Francisco right next to it. And what I like about it is that we have connections also to the East Coast as well. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. You have the best of the West Coast and the best of the East Coast. But when it came to other schools as well, I think I applied to Cornell because Cornell was in Ithaca, New York, upstate New York. But I like that seclusion a tiny bit, yet you can still get to the city. And other schools like in LA with UCLA and USC, you're in the city as well. You're getting used to it. Just make sure you know what you want in the future in regards to your career paths.
Yeah.
I think that's really important to understand when applying to these schools, and also when you're deciding as well.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense, especially location being such an important factor with respect to, again, internships, prospective jobs, people you're connecting with. So thanks for sharing that. Can you also maybe walk us through the application process for the course and for the program in terms of, what kind of timelines did you have set in place when you were in high school? And, when did that sort of typically begin for you before you actually got your decision?
Right. And so with Stanford, there's two basic dates to keep in mind. So you have the REA deadline, restrictive early action, and then you also have regular decision. Basically, it's this program where if you apply early to a private university in the United States and you get accepted, it's non-binding. So it's different from early decision, obviously, where you have to go no matter what. But this one is where you apply to the school, but it's the only private university in the United States you can apply to,
Hmm.
which is why it's restrictive, but you don't have to go to it, right? So other peer institutions that do this as well as Harvard, they also do restrictive early action. But basically, Stanford, statistically, I believe half of the students that they accept for their class come from restrictive early action. So basically, you apply in the end of October, and then you get accepted in about December. So you're already basically done by the time regular sessions come along in March. And so I didn't do that process, but I did that process with like early action schools that were target schools for me.
Right.
And so, as the college admission process becomes more competitive, as more people are applying to schools, I recommend for students basically start your essays early, right? That summer beforehand, make sure you start working on those applications. Make sure you have a narrowed list as well, right?
Hmm.
Make sure you have that list of your target schools, your far reaches, but also your safety schools to make sure that you get into a good university that you think you're going to thrive in. And so when it came to applying specifically to Stanford, I finished basically my Common App essay and also supplements around December. And so basically I finished all those statistics, got my teacher recommendations, made sure my counselor recommendations on there as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about maybe the uniqueness of the Stanford application, but Stanford has what I think is the best application because it allows you to really expose yourself in different context in terms of what the university wants to learn about you and so forth. So this application structure has four short answers. So basically you have 50-word short answers. So it's really quick, but they can really gauge a lot about you. So for example, the first question I believe is, what do you think is the biggest, I think, conflict in the world? Like what's the biggest issue in the world today? And another one's like, if you had to go back to one historical moment, what would it be? And another one was focused on like, why specifically Stanford, and so forth. So, and then also ask you like, what did you do in the last 2 summers, right? So basically basic questions, those 50-word responses. But then what I think is the most important essay, now I'm not an admissions officer by any means, but when it came to, I think one of the most important essays, it was the intellectual vitality essay. Well, the big things here at Stanford is intellectual vitality. That's the thing that they pride themselves in.
Hmm.
It's intellectual vitality, meaning learning for the pursuit of learning. You're learning, you're taking challenging classes because you want to learn it. You want to use that education in order to become a leader in the world in the future. And so basically you have that essay, it's a 250-word essay. And it's basically your passion essay, right? It's your essay about why you want to pursue education at Stanford. It's not because you want to go to Stanford for the purposes of going. No, it's to use that Stanford education to do something impactful for the world today. And then the second essay was the roommate essay, which is unique to Stanford. So basically it's a roommate, it's an essay that you write for your future roommate. And what do you want to share with them and so forth. So really that personal connection. And I believe the final essay is something that you haven't talked about in your application before. So it's like kind of that unique essay that you can take part of. And basically explore what you want to show to the admissions officers and so forth. So kind of a long application. I mean, you have 7 questions on top of the common application. But I believe that's the best way to go about it because Stanford wants to know everything about you so that when they know that what student they're accepting an authentic and genuine student that, can actually make a change in the world. And that's the biggest thing that I see on my campus today. You have students around here that, are representing their own countries. For example, I have a friend here from Belarus. She was the first student ever to be accepted from Belarus, and she wants to use her education in data science to really help her country in the future in terms of the geopolitical context over there as well. So just keep that in mind. If you do apply regular decision, that deadline is in early January, and you get your decisions back in March. So for me, I actually got my decision back on April 1st. So we're I believe, the last school that sends out admissions. And so basically, you get admitted to Stanford if you get in, and then you have admit weekend as well, that you go to meet your classmates and hopefully convince them to choose Stanford. So yeah, I think that's the whole process.
Wow, thank you. That was very comprehensive. I'm going to put you on the spot again and ask you about, certain profile building strategies that you might have used to make your profile stronger. And again, how did you start to maybe focus on those areas with respect to maybe the program that you were doing, if you already had that in mind while you were in high school?
Yeah, of course. So one of the biggest things is political science, right? So that was the center of my application. But I want to stand myself out. One of the biggest things I tell people is that you have to have that spike within your application. And so my spike was on the politics, policy, and legality of education reform. And so one of the things that I share was, my personal story with the education system within the United States. But what I did was, you know, I think the education system here in the US, it's very decentralized, right? So you have a lot of issues when it comes to the quality of the education, underfunding of public education, past areas of gerrymandering, redlining, and so forth, which makes it difficult for students to attain educational privilege and intergenerational wealth and so forth. And so for me, what I wanted to do was I first created, this study as part of my AP capstone class, which focused on educational gerrymandering in Charlotte's, North Carolina. And so basically, I focused on two school districts where I knew that there was basically the people that created the lines did it based on an economic calculation, where basically you had students that were low income go to a school that was underfunded, and people with high income go to a school that is, high income school, right? Because education in the United States is funded by property taxes. And so from that study, I then wanted to do more with it. So I decided to do some tutoring with Title I schools. And then from there, I was like, I want to do something when it comes to policy. And so after joining a bunch of national and international youth organizations dedicated to US policy, but also global policy, I joined a company that was called Our National Conversation. It's still running today. It's basically a organization dedicated to bridging the divide when it comes to American politics and policy, and using that to speak about reform in different areas such as healthcare, education, and so forth. So as part of that company, I was the director of community. The company was run by a former vice president of the Los Angeles Times, a major newspaper in the US. And so from that point, I was able to do a lot of work with community partners. I was able to be part of events with, like, for example, some news hosts from MSNBC. I was in contact with numerous CEOs of other organizations and companies, and I was able to invite them, and we were able to create action networks and high school initiatives and college initiatives. And then from that work, I transitioned to what I think was kind of my spike. I became the senior vice president of effective discourse at the Institute for Youth and Policy. So the Institute for Youth and Policy is the largest youth-run nonpartisan organization within the United States. We have hundreds of youth that work at the Institute for Youth and Policy. And during my time there, I was able to, I was in charge of events and partnerships. So one of the biggest things that I did was I created this program called the Speak Program, where I partnered with Bridge USA and the Cambridge Center for International Research to create a program for high school students to get into policy. And then from there, I created events with, for example, the President of Children Now, which is a big educational organization within the United States. I hosted events with a professor at USC to talk about the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. I hosted events with a Taiwanese professional, I believe at the London School of Economics, where she talked about China and Taiwan, the relationship between there as well. And then I was able to, really foster this culture within the company and so forth. And it was really fun to be part of the space where you have a lot of youth coming in there with policy and legal experience and just wanting to make a change. And so the biggest things I would tell students is that when it comes to the college admission process, sure, you can do this for your college application process in terms of like making a spike and so forth, but do something that you love that you're going to continue to do. And so here at Stanford, one of the biggest things is that I'm part of a lot of research centers here when it comes to politics and policy. And I'm still in contact with those people that I worked with in the past, and they've used that advice to help me in the future. So have that really genuine, authentic mission when choosing, your passion project, your spike, and so forth. And it's going to carry you a long way. Because guess what? Let's say you don't get into Stanford, right, or another university that's a prestigious university and so forth. You're still going to have that spike in the future because you're going to really like work in this field. So I think that's something that's really important to share. I hope you pursue whatever you want to pursue in the future as well.
That's really sound advice coming from someone so young, but obviously you've achieved so much during your high school period that you're able to sort of take so much and extrapolate that. Hopefully people can take a lot from that conversation and that answer as well. Did you have to give any tests to get into Stanford? Did you have any of those involved? And if you could tell us a little bit about that as well.
Right. So in the US, I know it's a different like situation for international students. I believe you have to take the TOEFL. I believe that's what it's
The
called.
TOEFL and the
But
IELTS both, yes. Or the
right,
IELTS.
right, right. Right. So you have those additional tests for international students, but here in the United States, you just have to take basically a choice of two standardized tests. I believe it is the same thing in other countries as well, the SAT and the ACT. Right. So the SAT is delivered by the College Board. It's out of 1,600. And I think they reworked it as well recently. But the SAT is basically this test that gets to know what your future is, your future academic ability. So it tests you based on that, and over what score you get is something that you can report to colleges or not, right? Stanford right now is test optional. And so we have the option of sending a test and so forth. And so when it comes to SAT, what I like to say is that if you score at above 1,500, I think you're fine. That's the score that you should be aiming for. It's going to be hard to get a 1,500 in the first place. But getting that score will be satisfactory and so forth. I did not take the SAT. I actually took the ACT. So the ACT is the other test that is accepted. And the ACT is a standardized test that focuses on what you have learned. So as opposed to, let's say, the SAT, which is based on your future academic ability, ACT is what have you learned so far to test you on that. So I took the ACT twice, and I got a super score of 34. And so 34 is out of 36. So basically, it's a good score, right? Stanford does, I believe, Stanford super scores. So keep that into account as well. But when it comes to the ACT, is divided into 4 sections. They have a reading section, writing section, math section, science section. But I think the ACT for me was just my best test because it's a fast test. But I thought I could, think on my feet in terms of like those questions as well. So I think when it comes to standardized testing, since all the universities now are basically test optional except for MIT, go and test. I think testing is really important. It really helps you in the long run because you're going to have a lot of students that are test optional, and you want to make sure that you're really competing. So test, especially if you're an international student, and so forth. So just keep that in mind when choosing a school. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. And did you, again, with respect to, again, for anybody who's listening to this, who has absolutely no idea about how the US application system works, obviously you have the Common app where you go in and it sort of helps you. It's sort of like a standard application that you can then fill out, and that can apply, that can just sort of send your application multiple universities. And then on top of that, for Stanford, you obviously had those extra questions that had to be filled out, given the credibility of the institution. Apart from that, once you maybe in the meantime, in the interim of getting your results, were there any interviews that you had to give or anything in addition to submitting the application?
Yes. So I might just highlight very quickly about the Stanford Common App application. Letters of recommendation are really important. I think one of the biggest things is that Stanford accepts, I believe, up to 6 letters of recommendation. So make sure you have those ahead of time. I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe that you can submit the letters of recommendation. If you already if they haven't submitted it just yet, they can submit a little bit after the window. So keep that in mind when choosing your recommenders and so forth. But when it comes to the process, before you get your admissions, decision and so forth, and after you submit your Common App application, you're going to have an interview, right? I think that's one of the biggest things. I'm not for sure what the statistic is, but I believe a lot of applicants get interviews with alumni in the area, right? So when it comes to, especially within the Indian subcontinent, there will be a lot of Stanford alumni that will be there as well. And so when it comes to my interview, I was interviewed by um, it was this former like president of the Associated Students of Stanford, and basically he was amazing. I mean, he taught basically the way the interview was structured was like he talked a little bit about himself, what his current work is, and so forth, to make you feel comfortable. But then he asked you questions. And one of the biggest things about the Stanford interview, as opposed to other universities, is that the interview is really centered around your interests. At least that's what my interview was on. So basically, he would ask me like, "What are you interested in?" And I would talk about, politics, policy, the legal side. I love the legal profession, so I hope to become a lawyer one day. So I talked about a lot about the Supreme Court, and so forth. And then from there, he was like, "Oh, at the time, Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was just nominated to the court. What do you think about her?" And then I would talk about that, and all of a sudden, we got into this entire conversation about the Supreme Court, packing the Supreme Court, what the progressive era, the New Deal era was about, how do it shape, get us out of the Gilded Age, how can we adopt those progressive reforms, New Deal reforms within the United States today, at a comparative context, how can we, adjust our modern liberalized democracies to other modern liberalized democracies today, what other policy initiatives have you been a part of? The interview is not really not a job interview. Like I've been part of job interviews where it's like, what are your skills? What are your talents? This interview is all about you in terms of applicant, what you have done, what you're going to continue to do as a student, why Stanford is going to propel you for that in the future, and why you think so critically about it. As I said before, intellectual vitality is one of the biggest things at Stanford. They're really seeing if you want to learn for the pursuit of learning, and then showing that, to the world. And talking to students here they're doing incredible stuff. I mean, one of my friends was just in Washington D.C. with Biden, working on mental health care policies. So I think that's one of the biggest things. Just for the interview process, after you submit your application, make sure you know why you want to go to Stanford. Make sure you understand, the gifts and talents that you want to share with the world, and make sure you have a really authentic reason why you want to pursue what you want to pursue. So that's my little thing about the interview process. You have one interview. I think my interview was for an hour. So just prepare ahead of time. That's what I recommend.
That's great. That's great advice. I'm going to now try to get a little bit onto the sort of sticky part, which is regarding finances and scholarships and tuitions. Currently, what are the options available to prospective undergrads for financing their education at Stanford? Is there a lot of availability of scholarships? And what are the areas that they can look into for those?
Right. And so Stanford does not do merit-based scholarships. Other peer institutions, I believe Duke University and Vanderbilt, they do merit scholarships, but Stanford doesn't. It's all need-based financial aid. So Stanford, they just instituted a new policy for admissions, and you can search it up as well. I believe it is if your family income is at $125,000 US dollar, you don't have to pay anything. I believe that's the new policy when it comes to Stanford. But it's either you don't pay anything or you don't pay tuition. Either one, that's fantastic. We want to rival basically Princeton and Harvard. I believe Princeton, Harvard, Yale institute those policies as well. And so basically, when it comes to our financial aid, our endowment at Stanford, I believe, is at $30 billion. So, I mean, when it comes to the financial aid services, it's incredible over here. One of the biggest things at Stanford is the community of first generation low income students. We also call them fly students. And there's a big community of fly students. If you are a first generation college student, if you are low income, and that financial aid is incredible. For me, I do receive financial aid from Stanford. And I think financial aid is something that has helped me attain an education. And financial aid goes on for 4 years throughout. And I think that's one of the biggest things And you can always talk to the financial aid office, contact them as well if you have any questions about how financial aid works. But yeah, I think when it comes to the financial aid that they offer you, it's based on your income. Here in the United States, we use the FAFSA. And I believe Stanford has, we also use it's used by the College Board, but it's another system for checking whether or not your finances and so forth. I'm not for sure how it works for international students in that sense. The only thing I would say though is that um, Stanford is need blind for US applicants, but I'm not for sure if they're need blind for international students. I think they take that into account within the application process as well.
Right. Hopefully people, can check that out on the website. I'm sure there's a lot of information out there. And I also maybe encourage, and that's something that you can speak to, reaching out to the admissions officer that's been assigned to students. How helpful was that during your process, in terms of getting your answers or getting any queries solved during the admissions process?
Yeah, I mean, it was incredible. One of the things is that you can actually go online and search up Engage Stanford, or on your phone, you can look up their Instagram called Engage Stanford. That's our admissions team. And so I think with the admissions team, they're willing to answer any questions that you have about the admission process. They're going to tell you how it is. You know what I mean? Stanford, they make sure that they show you how impartial the admission process is at the university, and they make sure that, if you have any questions about how the common application works, if you have to miss a deadline, they'll be able to answer your call. So basically, go to Engage Stanford. They were really helpful when it came to my application process, and also when it came to my decision. One of the biggest traditions of Stanford is that when you get admitted and you go to admit weekend, you meet with your admissions officer. So they're all on what we call main quad, where everybody knows Stanford for. And then they're all there and they're ready to talk to you. They're ready to speak about your application. They're ready to, meet with you and so forth. So they're really helpful. Contact them. It's important to contact them as well. Stanford does not do demonstrated interest. So don't think about like contacting an admissions officer in order to they're going to know, that I really want to go to Stanford, because I mean, Stanford gets a lot of applicants, right? So basically, don't think of it that way. Think of it as a tool for understanding how, admissions works, if you have any questions about it and so forth.
Makes sense. Typically, what's the average tuition fee? What's the tuition, the other added costs that people might want to kind of consider?
Yes. So if you want updated numbers, you can check out Stanford's website, but I believe the tuition is $60,000 and then plus $20,000 when it comes to the board fees, food, and so forth. So that was a total $80,000 in US dollars.
Well,
I
yeah.
mean, that's a lot of money. I mean, but I want to be honest here. Most of the students here at Stanford do not pay $80,000. The way our financial aid works is that I believe it's a progressive system. And so based upon how much your family income makes, you're in a specific place to get financial aid. And so the majority of students, they do not pay that $80,000. And so, but if you are paying that $80,000, just take that into account when making your college decision as well.
Great. And then do you have any opportunities to maybe earn extra income on campus, perhaps through interning, volunteering, other opportunities on campus itself?
Yeah. So I think this is what I like to do personally. One of the biggest things is that Stanford has over, I believe, 20 research centers on campus. And these professors and these researchers are looking for research assistants all the time. And so I'll talk a little bit about my research later maybe, but when it came to my research, I was part of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, where I worked at the Deliberative Democracy Lab under the supervision of Dr. Fishkin, one of the leading specialists when it comes to deliberative democracy. And I got paid working to create the next 100 years of California policy. How do we synthesize it? How can we expose this to, our focus groups and so forth, being part of the research. And it was great to, read research by major players within California and so forth. And then I was also part of the Hasso-Plattner Institute for Design, also known as the D School, one of the major hubs for design, but also, startup innovation within Stanford. And so when I was there, I worked on election administration. So I met with, for example, Tammy Patrick. I worked alongside her. Tammy Patrick was appointed by President Obama to work on election administration. And so I was able to be part of election administration policy, met with election administrators, worked with a team of specialists and so forth, got paid for it, which was really, really fun and cool. And then I was also part of, and I currently work for the Clayman Institute for Gender Research, where I research male friendships, male sociology, and so forth, because I'm really interested in sociology. So there's so many research opportunities here on campus where you'll make, a decent amount of money if you want to make money here on campus. But you can also work at different places. And for example, one of my friends works at the actual farm. One of the nicknames of Stanford is the farm, but we actually have a farm on campus. So he works at the farm, does a lot of agricultural work. I have another friend that works at the Hoover Institution, which is one of the major institutions on campus for politics and policy, where she does, I believe, documentation for World War II. I have another friend who worked at the bookstore, right? I mean, like one of those, like, everyday type of jobs as well. So many student opportunities to work. Like there's so many of them. So if you want to, help finance your education, there's a lot of places where you can do that at Stanford. So don't worry if you can't find a job. There's so many of them.
It's great. Thanks for sharing. That's going to encourage a lot of people. We've covered a lot of ground. Perhaps I just want to leave everybody listening with just like a conclusive step or takeaway on what they should actually look for as to prepare themselves for the next few years. Hoping some people listening to this will be in the 9th, 10th, 11th grade now, looking for their applications and building their applications. So what tips do you want to leave them with for preparing for Stanford or perhaps the undergrad in general?
Right. And I think one of the biggest things is that, if you're an underclassman, your freshman, sophomore, junior year, and so forth, one of the biggest things, take classes that you love, right? And then if you love a class that you're taking right now, keep pursuing it. One of the things was I took a class in my junior year. It's an AP class, right? It was called AP US History. And, from there, I learned so much about this specific era, the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, and the New Deal era. And then from there, I was so fascinated about it that I was like, how can we use those reforms to tackle our contemporary problems? So I went more into it, and that's how I got really into the policy space as well. So when it comes to, first take what you've learned in your classes, let's stick in with you. I know it's, tough sometimes. You don't want to do the homework, you don't want to study for the test, but sometimes these are really important. And also when it came to, let's say, statistics, for example, I took an AP statistics class. Understanding like confidence intervals, how we can use statistics for social good. Just take what you learn from your classes and then use that within your extracurricular work. Join clubs that you want to join. Join activities that you think are purposeful towards, having fun and pleasure, like, for example, like joining a sports team and so forth. But also join clubs like social justice, activism, issues that you care about as well. And then from there, you're going to encounter spaces where you can make not just an impact in your community, but also an impact in India and the entire world as a whole. And so that's what I think what's really important. Just be part of as many things that you want to do, but then specialize as well. So I think that's the best thing that you can do for your college application, but also the best thing that you can do to make sure that you just, lead a purposeful life and then really change the world, hopefully in the future.
That's great advice. Thank you so much for sharing that, Dylan. That does bring me to the end of the questions. But as I mentioned, I think we've been able to cover a lot of ground and you've been able to share a lot of insights, which I know will go a long way with everybody listening in. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.